we'll let you take it over.
All right, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Like she said, my name is Hope Walker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm the clinical director at the Rape Recovery Center, which we provide services in Salt Lake and Tooele counties. And so we're going to go over just a few things first with boundaries and advocacy, and then we'll also be talking about addressing some of those barriers that we see in accessing mental health care. So first, I wanted to start out by talking about and just having people reflect on what is the role of an advocate, or what is the role that you play in whatever capacity that you are working. And that's going to look very different depending on the agency you're at, and be thinking about what tasks are outside of your role. So typically that will be mental health therapy is not part of the role of the advocate. What are some tasks where there may be some flexibility? Maybe in some situations, this is something that you can assist with. In other situations, maybe it's not. And be thinking about where you might be unclear of your role, because that is where things can get really difficult. If we don't know if something is okay for us to do or not, that's where it can be difficult to know if we can move forward or if we need to refer some services out. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about what boundaries are. And a lot of what I've learned about boundaries has come from Nedra Glover-Tawwab. She is a therapist and has written several books about boundaries. Her basic definition of boundaries is that boundaries are expectations and needs that help you feel safe and comfortable in your relationships. And that's not just like relationships with friends or with partners, it's also professional relationships that we have with clients. And I also want to emphasize that being trauma-informed means that we have boundaries. Boundaries are helpful for us as professionals to know what we can and cannot help with. It's also helpful for clients. If we can't provide a service, that's helpful for them to know that, and they can be able to find that somewhere else. So with that, some typical types of boundaries that we may see are rigid, porous, and healthy. Healthy boundaries are where we have some flexibility. We are able to say no when we want to say no. We know what we need and we're able to communicate that. And that's what we strive for. Porous boundaries, and these are ones that I tend to see with people who are newer in the field. We come into the field to be able to help people, and we're passionate. And sometimes that can lead to us oversharing, not being able to say no, getting over involved in people's problems, accepting abuse or disrespect. And that can be problematic because that can really lead to burnout. On the other side, we don't want to have boundaries that are too rigid. And sometimes I see this when people are burnt out or they're getting to the verge of being burnt out. They don't ask for help. They can be really distant, very detached. They keep others at a distance, and they may say no to basically anything. So we want to be in the middle there where we're having some flexibility with our boundaries and also knowing what's a clear yes, what's a clear no. It's really normal for us to have a mix of these different types of boundaries. Maybe we have really healthy boundaries in a relationship with a partner, but our work boundaries are maybe a little bit more porous. It's okay. That's normal to have these different types of boundaries and different types of boundaries at different times too. It's good to check in and reflect of where might I need some work on some of these boundaries. And then too, the type of boundaries is going to depend on the setting that we're in. I think a lot of, the way that we show up in a hospital or a courtroom is going to look very, very different. And that's because it's a very different setting. And so the boundaries that we may have in those settings will look different. Culture is also something that can impact the way that we show up and the way that we have boundaries as well. And just another factor to consider as we're all working with clients of varying different backgrounds. So we all have different boundary types. So just to run through these really quick, we have physical, intellectual, emotional, sexual, material, and time. So most of these are fairly self-explanatory. Some of the big ones that I see with work and with clients are emotional boundaries and boundaries with time. So I'm going to go over those in a little bit more detail. So first, time. Time is such a big resource that we have. It's not something that we can get back once it's gone. And I know this is something that I often struggled with when I was first in the field of social work, where it can be hard to set really firm boundaries with our time, but it's really important. And so these are some red flags that we might see if we're interacting with people. Maybe they're calling multiple times in a row for something that's not an emergency. Um, Sometimes I see this where clients expect us to drop everything in order to provide help right now, for something that isn't necessarily an emergency. Or calling or sending text messages late when the recipient is sleeping. Um, it's amazing that we have the ability to text and email and call and be able to communicate in all of these different ways. And it can sometimes lead to some of these boundaries being blurred. And so those are some things, if we are in a place where we are able to communicate with clients in all these different ways, of figuring out what are those boundaries expected by my workplace, and also what are the boundaries that I need to be able to show up and do this work in a way that feels healthy for me. So some examples of that, some ways we can set some boundaries with our time, is only offering times when we're available. If you know that you work a shift that's 9 to 5 or an afternoon shift, whatever that is, only offering times when you are available. And that is, again, is just a boundary. And I think it also can save time when we're trying to arrange schedules, of being able to be clear and say, these are the times I am available. Another strategy is to figure out how we work best and sticking to that. Some people work really well writing things down or sending themselves emails. Figuring out what works best for you is going to help you be able to have those boundaries and be able to stick to them. And if you work at a place that offers you paid time off, making sure that you use that. That is a benefit, that is a part of your work. And if you're not using that, it's going to be really difficult to be able to keep showing up for the work. Another big thing is making time to disconnect from work. I know I see a lot of people who are incredibly passionate about this work and throw everything of themselves into it. And that, again, can really lead to burnout, where we're not taking care of ourselves, we're not having time for life outside of work, and we should be able to have life outside of work. And so I wanted to include some strategies of disconnecting from work because we all need that. The first one I have here is closing rituals. This can be something as simple of like a whole, maybe you have a routine of what you do when you leave the building for work, or when you leave your work from home office, or whatever situation you're working in. And then once you've like turned off the light or locked the door, whatever that is, work is staying there, and it'll be there for you when you log back in the next morning or clock back in the next day. Another big thing, again, with all of our technology, we can really make ourselves available 24/7. And for most work, that isn't sustainable and isn't required either. So figuring out, are there times when we can turn off notifications for emails, chats, texts when we're not available? I know for me, I don't have my work text messages on my phone. I do have emails where I can find them, but I don't get notifications. And I have chats available on my phone because I do supervise people and need to be in communication. But when I am on vacation, I turn those notifications off because my team knows that I'm not available. Um, Another strategy I have here is a container exercise. This is something that I will use with clients, but I think is also helpful for us as well in the workplace, where it's a basic idea of thinking about any type of container. A lot of times clients will have like, I have this box and I'm going to put all of the stressful things from this day into this box, and I'm going to put it like on my shelf in my office, and it's going to be there, and I can reopen that tomorrow or after the weekend or whenever it is you're coming back to work, and it's there for you. And if you start to think about work when you're outside of work, you can just imagine yourself taking that and putting it back in the box and putting it back on the shelf, and it's there for when you're back at work. And I've linked a container exercise in my slides as well that goes through that in more detail if it's of interest to people. Another thing I put there is making time to engage in play. And I think as adults, it's a really hard thing to do and also really important to be able to make some space for us to play. It's really good for our nervous systems and it just makes our life more full. And that can be anything from like playing with your dog or playing with your kids, playing a board game, or even just doing something that has nothing to do with anything, but you enjoy it. And that's going to look different for everybody. All right. So that was time boundaries. Emotional boundaries are another huge one in this work. And this can be sometimes clients will cross our emotional boundaries or we may cross clients' emotional boundaries. And so it's something that we need to be aware of in both contexts. And so we see this in ways of sharing too much too soon, emotional dumping, invalidating someone's feelings, telling people how to feel, or gossiping about the personal details of another person's life. And so those are more broad, but there are some things that we might see with clients as well. Some ways to manage this. I know self-disclosure is it can be really controversial and it looks very different for whoever you may talk to. But this is where self-disclosure can possibly cross our own emotional boundaries where we're sharing too much of ourselves and not centering the survivor. And so that's where I always start with this is if I'm sharing something, is this because it's going to be beneficial to the survivor or because I just want to share something? And if it's just because I want to share, or maybe I'm asking a question because I'm curious, that's probably something I shouldn't be asking. The focus should always be on the survivor because this is a professional relationship. Some other guidelines I have here, if we're sharing something, is it a wound or is it a scar? Are we sharing something that just happened and is really fresh? We shouldn't be sharing those things. If something's a scar, it's something that we've worked through, we've processed, it's something that we're able to discuss without becoming like sobbing. That may be appropriate to share if it is centering the survivor's experience. Some other things, preparing answers for common questions. I know even though I've been in the field for over a decade now, I will still get questions that come up that no one's ever asked me and maybe are a little uncomfortable. And that may be where I go with the next strategy where I place the question back on the person asking of, oh, why is that important for you to know the answer to this question? But I know there are certain questions when I'm working with like a new intern or a new employee that we know are going to come up. Working in Utah, there are certain things where I know it's really common for clients to ask about religion. And so knowing how you want to respond to that question can be a really helpful thing so that it's not catching you off guard in that moment. Sometimes if someone's asking a very personal question, maybe giving a little bit of a detail to move things forward, that can be a little bit different depending on what the question is and what your comfort level is. Again, always going back to, is this helping the survivor or is this about me? And then I put, when you do it wrong, rupture and repair. So in any relationship, we're going to do things wrong. And in professional relationships with clients, it's no different. We're human. And the biggest thing that we can do is be able to acknowledge, hey, I maybe shared something and I am not feeling like I should have shared that. I'm so sorry. Something like that would be a repair. So then we can be able to move forward. Okay. Some other things with emotional boundaries, and this is more for ourselves as workers. At the very beginning, like I talked about, being clear on what our role is. That can be really helpful because if we're dealing with some really difficult situations, as we do, we can be able to go back to what is my role in this and what maybe is something I'm taking on that isn't mine to take on and is somebody else's. Like if you know a client has a therapist and they're talking to you about all of these things in their life, being able to say, hey, are you talking to your therapist about this? Because that's not your role in that moment to be able to be processing these things with that client. And that can be a big relief of like, okay, I don't have to take on all of these things for this client. They have other supports in their life. And these are the people they can turn to for these things. So like I said, in referring to clients to therapy when needed. So sometimes that is a service that somebody needs, and being able to bring that up to a client is saying like, hey, have you thought about therapy? Are you interested in it? And being able to provide resources. And we'll go over some of those in a bit. Another big thing is debriefing. Working in a really difficult field, we need connection and we need people. And so I know I always find it incredibly helpful to be able to talk with my team when I have especially hard clients, and they feel similarly. We have regular meetings to be able to talk about clients and also just how we're doing as humans, and that can be really helpful. And being able to know who you can call and go to, like, is it a supervisor? Is it your boss? If there is something that you're not sure of, because that comes up. Like there's always just something new that comes up and we're maybe not sure how to handle it, and knowing who you can go to get that support can be really huge. Another big thing is knowing our own personal warning signs. Knowing and these are things that I'll go over with clients, but I think it's important for us to know for ourselves as well. We all have different signs that maybe are letting us know we're feeling burnt out, or maybe we're taking on some of the trauma of our clients, and that can look very different for different people. It can be things like maybe you're staying up too late, maybe your sleep's interrupted, maybe you're not eating very well, not exercising. It could be things like spending way more time on your phone than you normally do. Whatever those personal signs are for you, it's really good for us to know that about ourselves, so that if we're noticing that, we can be able to look into what's going on and see, like, do I need time off? Do I need more support at work? Do I need different boundaries? And then you can be able to go from there. And I also have here, be aware of your window of tolerance, which is this next slide here. This is something that I'll talk about with most of my clients, where we all have this green window here. That's our window of tolerance. And that's when we're in the zone. We're able to access reason and emotion. We can be mentally engaged. And that's where we want to be. We're not always in that window. We can go up into that red zone, hyperarousal, where we may be really emotionally distressed. We may feel really frazzled or anxious or panicky. We just can't calm down. And then we can go down into kind of that grayish area of hypoarousal. And that's where we may feel depressed, lethargic, numb, unmotivated. We may be dissociating a bit, not feeling like we're present. It's good to check in with ourselves of, where am I here? And are there things that I can do to get more into that window of tolerance? And how do I do that, right? Like that's, I think, a big question that clients have. They're like, okay, I know I'm not in my window, but how do I get there? And there are different things that we can do. And it can be things like in here it says mindfulness, grounding, breath work. Those are some good places to start. It can also be things like taking a walk, going and just taking a break and getting some water. It can be something really simple. And we don't have to fully be in that window, but if we can kind of just get closer to it, that can be more helpful so that we can be able to engage in the work. I also want to just talk about how that window of tolerance is very variable. It varies day to day, hour to hour, and acknowledging times when that window of tolerance for ourselves may just be lower. Maybe we're going through some really difficult things in our personal life, and so it's going to take a lot more work to stay in that window of tolerance. I know for clients, oftentimes we're able to predict some of those times when the window of tolerance is going to be lower. If it's an anniversary of a trauma, a lot of times holidays, birthdays are really big triggers. And so acknowledging, hey, like this is a time where I'm probably not going to be like stretching myself at work, and making sure that you're spending more time doing those things that feed yourself. And there are things that we can do to help widen our window of tolerance. And the first thing that we can do is just being aware of where we're at. Um, if this is something new to you, that really is the best place to start. And maybe checking in once a day of thinking, well, how is today going? Where am I feeling? Do I feel like I'm in my body? Um, do I feel like I'm able to access reason and emotion at the same time? And if not, what can I do to maybe try to get a little bit closer to that? Um, and then, yeah, like I said, trauma and stress can really impact how big that window is. And I think acknowledging that for our clients, they may have a really tiny window when they come in and see us. They've probably been through a very recent trauma, or they're getting really triggered from something recently. And so that window of tolerance is probably really small. And that is a big thing to consider when we're working with clients. Um, so I wanted to take a minute here just to kind of reflect on these questions. So personally, how can I tell when I'm in my window of tolerance? Like, what does that look like? What does that feel like to me? How do I tell when I'm in that hypoaroused? So that's the red here, where we're like anxious, can't calm down. Um, and then how can we tell when we're hypoaroused? So that's the depression, dissociated numbness. And then how can we tell if a client is out of their window of tolerance? What might we see there? So I'll give you a minute just to look at those questions, think about them, and in a minute I'll talk a little bit about what we might see when a client's outside of their window of tolerance. All right, so some things that we might see if someone's outside of their window of tolerance, and we don't always know. Sometimes we can't tell from the way that someone is presenting, but sometimes we may see things like they are kind of looking around, they're not making eye contact. Maybe they seem like they're not kind of zoning out and they're not connecting with you. It may be things like they're repeating themselves over and over again and asking the same question over and over again. There may be more physical things, like maybe they're shaking, maybe they're in shock. Those can be some signs that they're not in that window of tolerance. And that would be a time when we're not going to be like doing a bunch of education or asking them to do really complex tasks. I believe I have this on the next slide. Now we're going to skip that video. So those are some things that we might see when a client is outside of their window of tolerance, and it's good to recognize that because we may need to repeat ourselves more often than normal. That may be a time where we want to write things down for them so that they're not having to remember it because they probably won't. And we may want to maybe ask some of those things like, do you want to take a break if that's possible? Maybe we take a few, even if you as the person who's leading the meeting, like take a deep breath. That can be helpful because it can be a signal to them to breathe a little bit deeper, even without saying like, hey, let's take a deep breath together. So that can be some ways to try to bring them a little bit more into that window. And with that, so we're going to skip the video. We're going to shift gears a little bit about talking about some of those barriers to accessing therapy. So we'll say we've met with this client. We want to offer them therapy. Therapy is great. I'm a therapist. I want people to be in therapy, and it's a really hard thing to access. There's a lot of things that can get in the way. And I have a few things here. It's not all of them, but these are some things that I've consistently seen with clients. A big one right now, and I hope it's getting a little bit better, is just the availability. A lot of places have wait lists. And so that can be really discouraging for clients and for advocates to be calling and calling and calling of like, okay, this place says they're open, but they're actually not when I go to make an appointment. And that can be really frustrating. If people are having to make lots of phone calls and get on wait lists, it can be really discouraging and they may never get the care that they need. Another part is cost, and together with that, insurance or lack of insurance. So even if someone has insurance, the cost of therapy can still be too much, because copays can be expensive, or maybe they have insurance that doesn't have great mental health care coverage, and so they're still having to pay out of pocket for most of the expense. Maybe someone has Medicaid or Medicare, and those can also be difficult to find providers who take that kind of insurance. And then if there are typically places that have low cost or sliding scale fee, but they typically have wait lists or lack of availability as well. A huge thing we see at our agency is language barriers. Right now, we luckily don't have a wait list, but we don't have any bilingual therapists. And so we're only able to offer therapy in English, and there's a huge need for Spanish services in my area, and I believe most of the state as well. So that's a huge barrier that we see. And we have referral sources where there are Spanish speaking therapists, but again, there's wait lists. The insurance is a barrier, cost is a barrier. And then similar with that is culturally specific care. I tend to see a lot of folks from the queer community, and that's a population that I'm very passionate about and have lots of education about, but that isn't always the case. And so knowing the clients that we have and knowing like are there culturally specific places that maybe we can connect them with. So with that, some tips that I have is, so as I said, one big thing is insurance. And a lot of our clients have Medicaid, and knowing who takes Medicaid in your county is a huge thing. And knowing how do you find those people, how updated are their lists, and that can take a lot of work. And similarly with Medicare, and helping clients like read through their coverage and help them through that process as much as you can be really helpful, because it's really easy to give up at like really any step of the way, because there can be a lot of steps. Also, knowing who takes CVR in your area can be really helpful. So if you know a client's able to get crime victims reparations for therapy, that's great. And who in your area takes that? And sometimes that's a matter of really making networking connections, which we'll talk about in a second. Knowing what free resources are available in your community. I know for my area, one of the local colleges has some limited services that are free because it's a student training center. Knowing who offers services in languages other than English. And like I said, for our area, Spanish is a big one. So knowing what agencies have Spanish speaking therapists, and maybe what individual therapists in different agencies or maybe in private practice know Spanish is a huge one for us. Psychology Today is a really great resource. It's an online directory where therapists pay to have a profile. And sometimes that can be really good if we're looking for something very specific. You can filter by zip code, by insurance. You can filter by like sliding scale. You can do filters for things like LGBTQ or sexual assault or Spanish speaking, all kinds of things like that. They're not always completely accurate, but it is a good starting point. If you are in an area where there is like a local college or a university, knowing what resources they offer. Usually they have some sort of services for students. Oftentimes they're very short term, and sometimes there are wait lists. And that may be another thing that you want to know and connect with that resource as well. And if you work at an agency that offers therapy, knowing what the requirements are. At my agency, we have some pretty strict requirements of who we see for therapy, just because there is such a high need. And so for us, if someone's uninsured, we can possibly see them. Um, and sometimes we'll be able to see clients if they are insured, but the copay is too high, or if they are insured, but they're on their parents' insurance and they don't want their parents to know that they're seeking services related to sexual assault. So those are some of our specific requirements. And then knowing what that process is. For my agency, they see an advocate, and then the advocate can refer them to clinical services. And then I do an intake to determine if we can be able to see them and meet their needs. Sometimes I do an intake and there are higher needs than we can treat in once a week therapy. Someone needs maybe medications, or maybe they need more intensive therapy. And so we need to refer them out. And so if you're able to communicate that to clients of like, hey, this is what this process is going to look like, that can be helpful, because sometimes it is several steps until they're able to actually get into therapy. And then a big thing with this is developing relationships with referral sources. And that can take a lot of time and takes a lot of work, and can be a really invaluable thing for clients and helping them get into the services that they need. And that can be things like maybe asking around at different events in your community of, who else is in the similar field, who are they referring people to, asking around to see who takes crime victim reparations, and reaching out and asking what that process looks like, because that can be another really helpful thing to clients as well. If they are reaching out to people and they're like, I don't know, I've never done therapy before. What happens next? I sometimes forget that with my clients, that they maybe have never accessed therapy before, and they're like, I don't know, what is this? And so that will be part of our intake as well, of saying, hey, therapy is typically 50 minutes to an hour, typically weekly. This is what it looks like if we're in person. This is how it might look different if we're doing it over Zoom. And that can be really helpful for clients to know what that process looks like, because if it's something they haven't done before, they can have a lot of anxiety around it as well. Another big thing I wanted to put in here was emergency versus crisis. So the difference is, so an emergency is there's immediate action is necessary to prevent harm or to prevent further harm from happening. So that would be 911 does need to be called. If someone is saying, a lot of times we see crisis clients who are maybe somewhat suicidal. If they are saying, hey, I have a plan and this is when I'm going to do it, that would be an emergency. That's when we're calling 911 or making sure that they're getting to a hospital. Whereas a crisis is, yes, action is needed. Something needs to happen, but there isn't a danger happening right now. And oftentimes we are seeing people in crisis. It's not typically an emergency. Those do happen. And sometimes it's helpful to even recognize for ourselves, like, okay, this is serious. This is a crisis. We do need to intervene. And things will be okay if we don't get everything resolved today. I think a lot of times people come in crisis and they're not in their window of tolerance. It gets us out of our window of tolerance, which is really, really common. And then We're feeling like we have to do everything for them and we need to move really quickly. And that's not always in the best interest of us or the client either, because typically there are long-standing patterns and everything's not going to get fixed in an hour or two. We can have some great action steps in that time. We can get some great referrals going. We can get some great support in that time, but we're not going to fix everything. And so if we're able to ground ourselves and be able to recognize that we're not going to solve everything in this time we have together, but we can do a lot of good work, that's going to be better long term for both of us. So some things that we can do to manage a crisis. So this would be maybe a client is coming in and they are definitely not in their window of tolerance and it's a crisis, but not an emergency. Having us stay grounded in the moment. And that can be something as simple of like if you're starting to feel like, okay, I'm starting to feel maybe a little bit anxious or maybe like a little depressed because your situation feels really overwhelming. Just putting your feet on the floor and feeling your feet on the ground or in your shoes, and noticing that for just a second and checking in with your own breathing. Slowing down your speech can be a really big one. I know I've probably been talking really fast. I tend to do that when I get nervous. And it's an indication to me, like, if I need to slow down, maybe take a few breaths. And that can also be a good cue for our clients to help them slow down a little bit as well. And when they're slowing down, that can hopefully help their nervous system slow down a little bit more as well and get them a little bit more into that window of tolerance. The next one, lowering your voice. So, oftentimes when we are like in that the hyper aroused state, where we're maybe going too fast, we're getting anxious, our voice maybe tends to raise a little bit too. And sometimes clients will do that too. They can be really loud when they're feeling out of control. And so if we're able to lower our voice a little bit and slow ourselves down a little bit, it can help the client match us a little bit and get them a little bit more into that window of tolerance. Another big thing is repeating ourselves if needed, and recognizing that that is just a part of this process. It can be a little bit annoying to have to repeat yourself several times, but when we can recognize it's coming from a place where people are in trauma and they're in like a fight or flight response, and they need that information given to them multiple times in different ways, to be able to actually have that information stick, that can be helpful. And that's the next one, giving information in multiple formats. I know I'll typically, talk to people about different resources. And then I'll also ask, hey, can I email this to you or can I text it to you? Can I give you a piece of paper that has this on it so you can take it with you? I know, especially if there's something they can take with them, we have resource packets that we hand out to clients or survivors at hospitals when our advocates go in for a code R. And that's, there's a lot of information in there. And it's something that they can take with them. So they're not having to remember all of this while they're also going through an incredibly traumatic process. They can take it with them. And maybe a few days or a few weeks down the road, they can be able to pull out that information and look at it. And then same thing with like email or text messages. It's in a place where they can go back and find it. And then, as I said earlier, taking breaks. If we're able to even just ask, like, can I get you a drink of water? That's something that our client liaison will often do when a client comes in of, hey, can I get you a drink of water? And that's just a nice thing to help someone feel like, hey, someone's noticing me and my needs. And also is just a little bit of a break and a little bit of a reset. So people can maybe check in a little bit with their bodies. Oftentimes when people are in fight or flight, they're not listening because their brain is just focused on surviving. So they're not able to check in with some of those cues of like, am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Do I need to go to the bathroom? And so that can be just a good cue of, hey, yeah, maybe I do actually need some water and let's take, a few seconds to do that. That can often be helpful if someone is in that hyperarousal where they're just going and going and going and going. I often see that with new clients where they're like, I finally have someone who's going to listen to me. I have to get it all out right now. And that's not typically the most helpful thing. Being able to slow down can be really helpful. In being able to regulate their nervous system, because if they're always in that fight or flight place, they're just going to keep staying in a point where it's only focused on survival. Okay. I wanted to have lots of time for questions. So I want to open it up to those. And if there's any slides you want me to go back to, please let me know. But we do have plenty of time for questions. And I'm checking the chat here. So if there's anything specific, okay, go ahead, Hannah.
Hi, so I'm actually fairly new in the field myself. I'm an intern at the Iron County Sheriff's Department right now. One
Mhm.
question that I have is how do you go about addressing those maybe broken boundaries? Maybe if a client is overstepping their boundaries, how do you talk with them about that and help them understand your expectations?
Yeah, that can be one of the hardest things. And it can often be helpful if we work somewhere that has those boundaries set out. And I'd say as early as possible, the better. I know oftentimes, like even with our clinical team, we'll have things come up where we're like, oh, I didn't realize I needed to set a boundary around this. Because oftentimes we are having clients come in who have had no boundaries in their life and they're just trying to get their needs met in whatever way they can. And so if we can say, hey, this is our policy, like this is what this looks like, if we can set those things up first, that's better. Of course, that's not always possible. And it can be really uncomfortable. And it just acknowledging like this is a little uncomfortable and getting that supervision. I even will sometimes role playing with like a supervisor can be helpful. Like, okay, this person broke this boundary. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. Um, because that can be really uncomfortable for us of having to come in and set this boundary. Um, and like I said, it's also a really helpful thing for us and for the clients to know that those boundaries are there.
Is there any questions in the room? Sorry. Oh, yeah, just sorry. We've got one in the room. Hold just one moment.
All right.
Hi, Hope. Does Rape Recovery still have that 24-hour hotline for victims?
UCASA now does. Um, we did do the 24-hour hotline until I think about a year or two ago, and now it all goes to UCASA, the statewide hotline.
And UCASA's is in English and in Spanish. And
Yes.
providers can also call it to ask like what resources and things like that as well. Any other questions in the room?
And if are there any questions on um I know some of the just the barriers or things that people have seen. Are there other barriers that I didn't address that you've seen and have questions about? Um,
Okay, this isn't a question, but I noticed on one of your slides, it said like whether CBR was accepted by therapists. And if the victim can't find someone that accepts it, we can do like an insurance waiver. So I think that's important to note.
yeah, thank you. That is good to know. Okay, and then it's
Go ahead, yeah, you
Lexi.
put in the chat.
Oh, does someone in the room have a question?
So go ahead.
Okay, so I see Lexi in the chat says, can we go into more detail on strategies to disconnect from work? Yeah, that's a big one. Let me go back to that slide. Yeah, these are some basic ones to start with. Trying to think if there's other ones that I've used that have been helpful. A lot of it is practice. And sometimes we have clients who just really weigh on our minds a lot heavier than others. Maybe it triggers something in ourselves or something from our own history. And sometimes that may mean we need extra support and maybe we need our own therapist to be able to talk to talk through some of those things because it can be really, really heavy work. And with these two, I'd say checking in with our own warning signs. I know for me, if I'm not having time for some of my creative projects, I may be putting like something's going on and I need to make some space for that because that time is important. And sometimes there's times where it is just a little bit harder. Um and it may look like asking for some time off of work. And I know that can also be hard. I know I've had places where it's been hard to take off time because then you come back and there's just as much work. And so it may be talking with a supervisor about how do we make it so I can take some time off and not feel like I come back and there's more work for me to do. And if anyone else has other things that have been helpful for them too, because I know this is a big one in this work.
Is there anyone, what they do to disconnect? Yeah.
Now, do these need to be healthy strokes?
Healthy preferred.
Get two lists.
Healthy is probably the preferred in this space, but after 5, we can talk about the unhealthy. We're not facilitating something after 5, just
You know, I saw a thing today, and I just don't like cliches unless I use them. I saw, so one of them, it said like, self-care, you guys have seen this one. Self-care is, constructing a life that you don't have to escape from, and I'm like, I'm sorry, but like, I think we all want to escape from life at some point, so I don't like the idea of self-care, you know, because it's like, no, we need a minute, you know, life is going to be hard, and you can't just create a life that you never want to escape from. I mean, we don't have times or moments, and I agree with the premise, because, you know, we talked about this a lot with, you know, we can't just take a bubble bath and things feel better, and, you know, I do think it is, a pattern, you know, you have to, a practice that you have to get into. But I just want to make a note that it's not just, you know, you're not, there's nothing wrong with you. If you're like, you just can't get this pattern, because then you feel stressed out because you're not doing your self-care enough, and we don't need that. But let's see, on a serious note, since I'm still talking now, journaling that actually has been really good for me, is just getting in a pattern of just writing. There, that's my healthy strategy.
I like it. I've been doing a lot of watercolor. That's my de-stress.
It's great.
Anyone else? Anyone can add in the chat too, things they do. What was the container exercise again?
Yeah, so it's the basic container exercise is and it can even be like a physical thing, like if that makes more sense to you. Or just like, hey, there's this box in my mind and I'm gonna imagine myself putting it on the shelf in my office. That's where it lives and that's where all the work stuff goes. And like I'll usually walk through it with a client of like, hey, what does this container look like? And maybe they say, it's a chest. And I say, how do you know what you put in there is not going to come out? And they'll say, oh, I close it, I put a lock on it, and then I put another lock on it. And then throughout the week or day or night, you know, whatever that break is that you have from work, if things come up, you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot about this client. I hope they're okay. You can kind of say, okay, yep, that client, we're going to put them in the box. We're going to come back to them at work. There's nothing I can do for them right now. And that's that basic container exercise. And there's a lot of different ways to do it too.
Thanks. I wasn't sure. Lisa had said in the chat, Weber County has had 11 child homicide cases. That is a lot, since January. And that she'd like to thank the surrounding advocates for all their support and get-togethers to help get through the trauma. Lisa, I'm sorry you guys have had that many. That is a lot, but I'm glad that you have some good partners to lean on. And I think that's such a good thing to know as advocates, to have kind of those people that are in your corner. That was part of why we wanted to do the breakout, so you can get to know more people too, so you have other people to debrief with. Yes, I am speaking English. I wanted to confirm I was speaking English. So sorry. So. Sorry. Any other thing that you want to have questions or want to add?
Hannah has a good one in the chat. She says, one thing I've done since high school was imagine myself in a safe place. For me, it's usually a forest, and I imagine that my soul is floating in front of me. Yeah, that's beautiful. So and then there are chains attached to my soul that represent the stuff weighing me down and making it harder to function. Then I imagine cutting those chains and letting that burden go. I love that. And that, yeah, having some sort of visual, like everyone is very different in what helps for them. Some people have really rich imaginations, and having those safe places that they can go through, and it's also can be really helpful to connect to the senses if you do have like an imaginary or safe place that you're going to, of like, what do I see, what do I hear, what do I smell, is there any tastes, and going through those can be really helpful in helping our nervous systems regulate too.
I am not good at the visuals, so I love that you are, Hannah. That's awesome. Okay. Perfect.
Hannah reminded me one of my favorite things to do was actually like physically take off my badge and like leave it in the car. Like I don't let my badge come in my house. That's just, I'm gonna lose it in my house to start with. It'll get misplaced, as my coworkers already know how I misplace important things. But there was just something about it, leaving it in the car and knowing that when I'm in my house, like I'm trying to check out. But it's a constant practice and a constant reminder. One of my favorite, like what types of like self-care, like bubble baths. I don't do baths, but I have longer hair. So sometimes like, okay, I need to sit down and just brush my hair today. Like I'm gonna actually do my hair today and be reminded that I am a person, I am a human, and I deserve to take care of myself while I'm taking care of others as well.
I like that.
I think having something physical can be really helpful. I know with the pandemic and a lot of people doing at homework, it really blended the spaces that we have. And so if there's something even physical, if you are working from home, maybe part of the time of like, how do I close the door, or, do something that represents, I am done with work and we're not checking back in until it's time to come back.
That definitely has been an adjustment for me. Never pulling up a lot. Awesome, great tools. Any other questions or anyone else have a comment? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Hope, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Such good information. We really appreciate your time and expertise in this topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll put my email address in the chat if people want to follow up.
Okay, that'd be awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hope.